Case 1, Rachelle Bond. May 2015, Suffolk County, Boston, Massachusetts. The harbor has always been the soul of Boston. For nearly 4 centuries, those dark green waters have carried commerce, history, and the dreams of immigrants who arrived with nothing but hope. Fishermen have cast their nets from its shores. Children have watched the ferries cut across its surface on summer mornings. The harbor is woven into the identity of this city in ways that are almost impossible to fully articulate. It is the place where Boston breathes. But in the summer of 2015, the harbor gave something back that Boston was not prepared to receive. On the 25th of June, 2015, a woman walking along the shoreline of Deer Island, a narrow peninsula that juts into the outer harbor near Winthrop, noticed something caught among the rocks near the water's edge. It was a blue plastic bag, partially submerged, partially exposed by the retreating tide. She called the authorities. When investigators arrived and carefully opened that bag, what they found would stop an entire city in its tracks and launch one of the most emotionally charged missing identity investigations in the history of Massachusetts law enforcement. Inside the bag was the body of a little girl. She appeared to be between 1 and 4 years of age. She had dark, curly hair. She was wearing black and white polka dot leggings. She had delicate features. She was small enough to be cradled in a single pair of arms. And she had absolutely no identification. Nothing that could tell the investigators standing over her who she was, where she had come from, or who had loved her. The Massachusetts State Police and the Boston Police Department opened a joint investigation immediately. The medical examiner's office conducted a thorough examination. What they determined was this: the child had not drowned. She had not been swept away by accident. The injuries she sustained were consistent with a severe, deliberate act of harm. Someone had caused her death. Someone had then placed her body inside that trash bag. And someone had carried that bag to the edge of the harbor and thrown it in, gambling that the water would swallow the evidence and that this little girl would simply disappear. She did not disappear. But for months, she also had no name. Law enforcement and the public began calling her Baby Doe, a placeholder name used in cases where the identity of a deceased individual cannot be immediately established. But even as investigators worked tirelessly behind the scenes, running DNA comparisons, checking missing persons databases across multiple states, reaching out to hospitals and social service agencies, Baby Doe remained a mystery. Weeks passed. The summer turned. The investigation continued without a breakthrough. Then came the decision that would change everything. Working with forensic artist Roz Mast, investigators commissioned a digitally reconstructed composite image, a lifelike rendering of what Baby Doe might have looked like in life, based on the physical characteristics observed during the examination. That image was released to the public in mid-July of 2015, accompanied by a description of the polka dot leggings she had been wearing when she was found. The image was shared online. It moved across social media platforms with extraordinary speed. News organizations picked it up. Ordinary citizens shared it from their phones, their computers, their tablets. Within days, the composite image of Baby Doe had been viewed tens of millions of times across the country and around the world. People responded with an outpouring of emotion unlike anything investigators had anticipated. Mothers looked at that digitally reconstructed face and recognized something in it. The universal face of a child who deserved protection, who deserved a name, who deserved someone to stand up and say, "I know who she is. She matters. She was real." But weeks continued to pass without a confirmed identification. Then, in September of 2015, nearly 3 months after Baby Doe had been found on the rocks of Deer Island, a tip came in. Someone who had seen the composite image recognized the child. That tip led investigators to a Dorchester apartment building on Glenway Street, a quiet residential street in one of Boston's most tightly knit neighborhoods. And inside that building, the investigation took a turn that no one who had been following the story had been fully prepared for. The tip pointed to Rachelle Bond, a woman in her early 30s who had been living in the apartment with her boyfriend, a man named Michael McCarthy. Bond had a 2-year-old daughter named Bella. Bella Bond had not been seen by anyone in some time. Investigators moved quickly. On the 15th of September, 2015, Boston police arrested both Rachelle Bond and Michael McCarthy. Bella Bond, the little girl with the dark curly hair and the polka dot leggings, had been identified. She was 2 years old. She had been alive and in the world for only 730 days before her life was taken from her. What emerged from the investigation in the months that followed painted a picture of a household defined by instability, substance dependency, and a catastrophic failure to protect a child who could not protect herself. According to prosecutors, it was Michael McCarthy, Bond's boyfriend, who had caused Bella's fatal injuries. McCarthy, who had a history of erratic and disturbing behavior, told investigators that he believed Bella was possessed by a demonic force. He described the child in terms that alarmed every person who heard them, not as a 2-year-old girl who needed love and security, but as something threatening, something supernatural, something to be subdued. Prosecutors presented evidence that McCarthy had acted on those beliefs in a violent and catastrophic way during the spring of 2015, causing the injuries that ended Bella's life. But Rachelle Bond was not simply a bystander who had been overwhelmed by events she could not control. According to the case presented by the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, Bond had been present in the apartment, had been aware of what was happening to her daughter, and had made a series of choices in the aftermath that compounded the tragedy in ways that prosecutors argued amounted to criminal culpability. Rather than calling for help, rather than reaching out to emergency services or to anyone who might have been able to intervene on Bella's behalf, Bond had allowed McCarthy to take control of what happened next. What happened next was that Bella's body was placed in a trash bag and carried to the harbor. McCarthy was charged with first-degree murder. After a trial that drew sustained media attention across New England and beyond, he was convicted of second-degree murder in 2017 and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. The jury found that while the evidence established that McCarthy had caused Bella's death, the prosecution had not proven premeditation to the standard required for a first-degree conviction. Rachelle Bond, in a development that shocked many observers who had followed the case closely, accepted a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact to murder. Under the terms of that agreement, she received a sentence of time served, meaning she was released from custody. The resolution of her case generated considerable public debate. Advocates for child welfare organizations argued that the sentence did not adequately reflect the degree to which Bond had failed her daughter. Others noted that Bond had cooperated with prosecutors and that her testimony had been essential in securing the conviction of Michael McCarthy. Those debates, while understandable, cannot obscure the central truth of what happened in that Dorchester apartment in the spring of 2015. A 2-year-old child was placed in a position of absolute vulnerability. The adults who were responsible for her safety failed her in the most complete way imaginable. And when she was gone, those same adults attempted to ensure that no one would ever know her name. But Boston knew her name. By the end of the summer of 2015, the entire country knew her name. Bella Bond was 2 years old. She deserved a childhood. She deserved the simple, ordinary gift of being kept safe by the people who were supposed to love her most. The investigation that bore her name, and the system of child welfare advocates, law enforcement professionals, and ordinary citizens who refused to let her remain anonymous, stands as one of the most powerful demonstrations in recent Massachusetts history of what communities can accomplish when they refuse to look away. In the aftermath of the case, the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families, the state agency responsible for child welfare oversight, faced intense scrutiny. Investigators and journalists examining the case found that the agency had received prior reports regarding the household in which Bella had been living. The question of what had been done with those reports, and why the intervention that might have saved Bella's life had not occurred, became the subject of official review and public reckoning. The legacy of Bella Bond is not simply the story of what was done to her. It is also the story of what her case forced a city and a state to confront about the systems, and the gaps within those systems, that are supposed to stand between vulnerable children and the harm that can reach them when no one is paying attention. If you take only one thing from Bella's story, let it be this. If you are ever concerned about the safety of a child in your community, please make the call. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at 1-800-422-4453. One phone call can change everything. Justice was delivered to Bella Bond. It came too late for her to feel it, but it was delivered, and the city that held her in grief for 3 months while she had no name has never forgotten her. If this case moved you, Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support allows us to keep telling the stories of victims who deserve to be remembered. Case 2. Alexis Aldamir, November 17, 2022, Suffolk County, South Boston, Massachusetts. Some investigations begin with a discovery so profoundly disturbing that the investigators who make them carry the weight of what they found for the rest of their professional lives. The case that emerged from a South Boston apartment building on a Thursday in November of 2022 is one of those investigations. It began, as many such cases do, not with a dramatic moment of detection or a breakthrough in a long-running inquiry, but with something far more ordinary. A call to authorities regarding a residential unit in the South Boston neighborhood, a dense and historically working-class section of the city that sits on a peninsula between the Fort Point Channel and Dorchester Bay. South Boston, known locally and affectionately as Southie, is a neighborhood with a complicated history and a fiercely loyal community identity. It is a place where people know their neighbors, where front stoops serve as informal gathering points, where the rhythms of community life are visible and felt. Which makes what investigators found inside that apartment on the 17th of November all the more staggering. When law enforcement entered the unit, they discovered something that would become one of the most unsettling and legally complex cases in Suffolk County in recent memory. In the freezer of the apartment, investigators found the remains of 4 infants. 4. The discovery prompted an immediate and extensive investigation involving the Boston Police Department, the Massachusetts State Police, the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, and the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. The woman connected to the apartment was Alexis Aldamir. She was a resident of the unit. DNA analysis conducted in the months following the discovery established a biological connection between Aldamir, her late partner, who had passed away prior to the discovery, and the 4 infants whose remains had been found in the freezer. The investigation that followed was meticulous and exhaustive. The Office of the Chief Medical Examiner worked carefully to determine whatever could be established about the circumstances surrounding each of the 4 infants. The central question, the question upon which any potential criminal charges would ultimately rest, was whether the infants had been born alive, and if so, what had caused their deaths. That question proved to be one that the available physical evidence could not answer with the certainty that the law requires. In April of 2024, approximately 17 months after the initial discovery, the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office announced that it would not be filing homicide charges in connection with the case. The DA's office stated publicly that while the discovery of the remains was deeply troubling and had been taken with the utmost seriousness throughout the investigation, prosecutors could not establish beyond the reasonable doubt required for a criminal conviction that the infants had been born alive, or that a crime as defined by Massachusetts law had occurred. The announcement was met with a range of reactions from the public and from advocates who work in the fields of child welfare and reproductive health. Some observers argued that the DA's decision reflected the appropriate application of the legal standard, that in a system built on the principle that a defendant is innocent until proven guilty, prosecutors who cannot establish the essential elements of a crime beyond reasonable doubt are ethically bound not to proceed. Others expressed deep unease, arguing that the circumstances of the discovery, for infant remains stored in a freezer in a residential apartment, demanded a more aggressive prosecutorial response regardless of the evidentiary challenges. The legal and ethical terrain navigated by this case is genuinely complex. Massachusetts law, like the law of most states, requires that a child be born alive and demonstrate some evidence of independent existence outside the womb before the criminal statutes governing harm to persons can apply to their death. When physical evidence cannot establish whether that threshold was crossed, the law as it currently exists does not permit prosecution to proceed. What is not in dispute is the profound weight of what investigators found in that South Boston apartment. 4 sets of infant remains, a freezer, an ordinary residential building in the heart of a Boston neighborhood. Whatever the legal resolution of the case, the discovery itself represents a moment that challenged investigators, prosecutors, medical examiners, and the community to grapple with questions about life, death, accountability, and the limits of what the law can reach. The case remains one of the most discussed and debated criminal investigations in recent Boston history, not because it ended with a conviction, but precisely because it did not. In a true crime landscape often defined by clear villains and definitive legal outcomes, the Aldamir case occupies a more uncomfortable and more genuinely complicated space. It asks us to sit with uncertainty. It asks us to acknowledge the limits of what forensic science and legal standards can sometimes establish. And it asks us, quietly, persistently, to think about what accountability looks like when the machinery of the law reaches the boundary of what it can prove. Child welfare advocates in Massachusetts have pointed to this case as one of several that highlight the need for ongoing investment in forensic pathology resources and in the legal frameworks that govern investigations involving infant remains. The conversation it started has outlasted the investigation itself and will likely continue for years to come. For the 4 infants at the center of this case, there are no names in the public record. There is no funeral that was reported, no grave that was publicly marked. What there is, now, is a community that knows they existed, that knows a discovery was made, that an investigation was conducted, that the legal system grappled with what it found even if it could not reach a resolution that many people believe the circumstances warranted. That knowledge matters. Bearing witness matters. Even in cases where the law reaches the edge of what it can do and stops, the act of remembering, of refusing to let the most vulnerable among us simply fade from the record, is itself a form of accountability. If this case raised questions for you about child safety and accountability, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every subscriber helps us continue this work. Case 3, Lindsay Clancy, January 24, 2023, Plymouth County, Duxbury, Massachusetts. There are cases in the true crime landscape that do not fit easily into the categories we reach for when we try to make sense of tragedy. Cases where the facts themselves, examined carefully, honestly, and with full acknowledgement of their complexity, resist the simple narrative of a monster who did a monstrous thing. Cases where what happened is undeniably devastating, and where the path to understanding it requires us to hold multiple painful truths at the same time. The case of Lindsay Clancy is one of those cases. On the evening of the 24th of January, 2023, in the town of Duxbury, a historic coastal community approximately 30 miles south of Boston, situated on the edge of Plymouth Bay, a call came in to emergency services that would shatter a family, stun a community, and ignite a national conversation about postpartum mental illness that continues to this day. Duxbury is a town with deep historical roots. It is one of the oldest communities in Massachusetts, with a character defined by its proximity to the coast, its historic architecture, its strong tradition of civic engagement, and its reputation as a safe and stable place to raise children. It is the kind of town that appears, from the outside, to be insulated from the kinds of acute crises that define many of the cases in this documentary. It is a town where, on a January night, the idea that a 911 call of this nature could come from one of its residential streets would have seemed, to most residents, almost impossible. Lindsay Clancy was 32 years old. She was a nurse. She was a mother of 3 children. Cora, who was 5 years old, Dawson, who was 3 years old, and Callan, who was 8 months old. By every account available in the public record, Lindsay Clancy had been a devoted and caring mother during the years before the events of January 24th. Photographs from that period, which circulated widely in media coverage following the case, show a family that, from the outside, presented as warm, stable, and loving. But those photographs did not capture what was happening inside Lindsay Clancy. In the months leading up to January of 2023, Clancy had been experiencing severe and escalating mental health challenges. She had been prescribed multiple psychiatric medications. She had been seeing mental health professionals. The records of her treatment, which became part of the legal proceedings that followed, documented a woman in profound psychological distress, a woman whose grip on the reality around her had been dangerously compromised by what her defense team would later describe as a severe and acute episode of postpartum psychosis. Postpartum psychosis is not postpartum depression. This distinction is critically important to understanding this case, and it is a distinction that mental health professionals and advocates have worked hard to communicate to a public that sometimes conflates the two conditions. Postpartum depression, which affects approximately 1 in 7 women who give birth, is a serious and debilitating condition that can have profound effects on a mother's ability to function and to care for herself and her children. It deserves serious attention and effective treatment. But postpartum psychosis is a different category of illness entirely. It is a rare and medically serious psychiatric condition that affects approximately 1 to 2 women out of every 1,000 who give birth. Its symptoms include hallucinations, delusions, severe confusion, rapid mood shifts, and in the most acute cases, a complete break from reality. Medical literature on the condition documents cases in which women experiencing postpartum psychotic episodes have acted in ways that are utterly inconsistent with their baseline personalities and their established histories as parents and caregivers, actions they would have found incomprehensible and abhorrent if described to them in any other state of mind. The onset of postpartum psychosis is typically rapid. A woman who appeared to be managing adequately on one day may be in the grip of a full psychotic episode within hours. The condition requires immediate medical intervention. It is a psychiatric emergency in the fullest sense of the term. And the challenge of identifying it in real time, before it reaches its most acute and dangerous expression, is one that the mental health community has been working to address for decades without yet fully solving. Lindsay Clancy had been in contact with medical and mental health professionals in the period leading up to January 24, 2023. She had been prescribed medications. She had been seen. The question of whether the severity of her condition was adequately recognized and treated during that period, whether the standard of care she received was sufficient to the actual crisis she was in, became one of the most painful and contested elements of a case that was painful and contested at every level. On the night of January 24, 2023, Lindsay Clancy's husband, Patrick Clancy, left the family home briefly to pick up food. During the time he was away, Lindsay Clancy harmed all 3 of their children. By the time emergency services arrived, Cora, Dawson, and Callan had all sustained critical injuries. Cora and Dawson did not survive. Callan, the youngest, passed away several days later in the hospital. Lindsay Clancy, in what prosecutors have described as a suicide attempt, sustained severe injuries when she went through a window of the family home. The community of Duxbury received the news with a grief that was almost physical in its intensity. Cora had been a student in the local school system. She had teachers who knew her. She had classmates who had sat beside her. Dawson had been known to the families in the neighborhood, a 3-year-old presence in the life of a community that, like all communities, had grown accustomed to the small daily textures of its children's existence. The loss of all 3 Clancy children in a single January night was a wound that the town is still processing. Patrick Clancy, in a public statement that moved many who read it to tears, asked for compassion, not for what had been done to his children, but for the wife he said had been consumed by an illness she had not chosen and had not wanted. His statement was extraordinary in its grace and in its refusal to collapse a devastating situation into a simple story of guilt and blame. It was also deeply controversial. Many people, reading about the deaths of 3 children, found it impossible to extend the compassion he requested. That tension between the grief of a community for children who were gone and the insistence of a devastated husband that his wife was herself a victim of something she could not control is at the heart of the Clancy case. It is a tension that the legal system is designed to navigate, however imperfectly, through the mechanism of the trial. Lindsay Clancy was indicted on charges of murder and attempted murder by a Plymouth County grand jury. Her legal team entered a plea of not guilty and has consistently maintained that postpartum psychosis was the primary and governing cause of what occurred on January 24th. The prosecution has not disputed that Clancy was experiencing a mental health crisis. The legal question at the center of the case, a question that remains unresolved as of this documentary's production, is whether that crisis rises to the level of a legal defense under Massachusetts law. Massachusetts, like most states, recognizes the defense of lack of criminal responsibility, the legal principle that a person who, as a result of a mental disease or defect, lacked the substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of their actions or to conform their conduct to the requirements of the law, cannot be held criminally responsible for those actions in the same way that a person of full legal capacity would be. The application of that standard to the specific facts of the Clancy case is the question that the Plymouth County Court will ultimately be called upon to resolve. The case has prompted mental health advocates, medical professionals, legal scholars, and bereaved families across the country to engage in one of the most substantive public conversations about postpartum mental illness in American history. Organizations that work with mothers experiencing postpartum conditions have pointed to the Clancy case as a devastating example of what can happen when the mental health system fails to adequately identify and respond to the severity of a patient's condition before a crisis reaches its worst possible expression. They have also pointed to it as a case that illustrates the catastrophic consequences of under-resourced postpartum care, of a medical and mental health infrastructure that, despite the best efforts of individual clinicians, does not yet reliably catch every mother who is falling through the floor of her own mind before the fall becomes irreversible. The question of what an adequate system of postpartum mental health care would look like, what screening protocols, what treatment thresholds, what crisis intervention mechanisms, what support structures, is one that the Clancy case has pushed to the center of the national healthcare policy conversation in ways that may ultimately save lives, even as the case itself represents the loss of three. Cora Clancy was 5 years old. Dawson Clancy was 3 years old. Callan Clancy was 8 months old. They are the center of this story. Whatever the legal resolution of their mother's case, whatever conclusions individuals reach about guilt, illness, and accountability, those three children are the ones who are gone. They are the ones whose absence their father carries with him every day. They are the ones whose lives ended in a house on a quiet street in a coastal Massachusetts town on a January night when everything fell apart. The Clancy case does not offer the moral clarity that many of us seek when we engage with true crime content. It offers instead something more difficult and more important, a window into the human cost of a mental health crisis that was not adequately recognized or treated before it became catastrophic. And it offers a challenge to a healthcare system, to a legal system, and to a society to do better for the mothers who are suffering in silence before the silence becomes something none of us can undo. If you or someone you know is experiencing symptoms of postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis, please reach out to Postpartum Support International at 1-800-944-4773. Help is available. Early intervention can make the difference between a crisis that is caught and a crisis that is not. This case is one that stays with you. If it moved you, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour for more investigative documentary content. Case 4, Janette MacAusland, April 24, 2026, Norfolk County, Wellesley, Massachusetts. Some cases arrive in the news with a weight that is different from anything that has come before. Cases so recent, so raw, that the communities surrounding them are still in the early stages of processing what happened when the cameras arrive and the documentation begins. The case of Janette MacAusland is one of those cases. Wellesley is one of the most affluent communities in the greater Boston metropolitan area. Situated approximately 12 miles west of the city, it is a town of beautiful tree-lined streets, high-performing public schools, and carefully maintained residential neighborhoods where the lawns are green and the houses are large, and the assumption, the comfortable, unexamined assumption that prosperity tends to generate, is that the children inside those houses are safe. Wellesley is also a town with an extraordinarily strong educational culture. It is home to Wellesley College, one of the most respected liberal arts institutions in the country. Its public school system consistently ranks among the highest performing in Massachusetts. Families relocate specifically to place their children in Wellesley's schools. The educational achievement and the physical safety of children are, in the Wellesley community, values that are not merely assumed but actively and visibly cultivated, which is part of why what happened on the 24th of April, 2026, was so staggering in its impact on the town. On that Thursday afternoon, authorities conducting a wellness check at a residence in Wellesley made a discovery that sent shock through the town and reverberated across the entire Boston metropolitan area. Inside the home, investigators found 2 children who were not alive. They were Kai MacAusland, who was 7 years old, and Ella MacAusland, who was 6 years old. Their mother, Janette MacAusland, was taken into custody. According to statements reported in connection with the case, MacAusland told investigators that she had caused the deaths of her children. The statement attributed to her in court documents, that she had wanted her children to go to God together, was one of the most striking and profoundly troubling elements of a case that had already generated enormous public attention. The phrase itself, that desire, that intention, as articulated to investigators in the aftermath of the tragedy, raises questions that a community, a mental health system, and a legal system are all, simultaneously, trying to answer. What does it mean when a parent expresses that kind of intention? What state of mind does it reflect? What signs, if any, were present in the days and weeks and months before April 24th that might have indicated the depth of the crisis MacAusland was experiencing? And who, if anyone, had seen those signs, and what had happened as a result? These are not questions that this documentary, produced in the immediate aftermath of the case, can fully answer. They are questions that the ongoing Norfolk County legal proceedings and the investigations that support them will attempt to address in the months and years ahead. MacAusland was arraigned at Norfolk County Superior Court on the 6th of May, 2026, facing charges of murder. She entered a plea of not guilty. The case was in its early stages as of the production of this documentary, and the full details of the investigation and the circumstances leading up to the events of April 24th had not yet been disclosed in open court proceedings. What investigators and prosecutors were working to establish in the weeks following MacAusland's arrest was the full picture of what had happened inside that Wellesley home. What sequence of events, what state of mind, what chain of circumstances had culminated in the deaths of two elementary school children in an affluent suburb on a Thursday afternoon in late April. The wellness check that led to the discovery is itself a detail worth dwelling on. A wellness check is initiated when someone, a family member, a neighbor, a school official, a friend, has a concern about a person's well-being and reaches out to law enforcement to request that someone go and check on them. It is, in its most essential form, an act of community care, a mechanism through which the concern of one person can translate into the presence of someone with the authority and the ability to assess a situation and intervene if necessary. In the MacAusland case, the wellness check was the mechanism through which the deaths of Kai and Ella were discovered. Someone was concerned. Someone made the call. And the officers who responded found what they found. The question of what had led to that wellness check, who had the concern, what had triggered it, what had been noticed and by whom, is one of many details that will emerge as the legal process unfolds. Wellesley is a community with deep roots and a strong sense of civic identity. In the days following the discovery, residents expressed grief that did not seem to know where to put itself. The kind of grief that a community feels when the thing that has happened is so far outside the parameters of the imaginable that the usual rituals of mourning and support do not seem sufficient to contain it. Flowers appeared near the home. Messages of condolence circulated through local social media groups. The Wellesley Public Schools, where Kai and Ella had been enrolled, issued statements of condolence and made counseling resources available to students and staff. The school community's response is worth noting because it reflects something important about the particular nature of this loss. Kai and Ella MacAusland were not abstract victims. They were children who had sat in classrooms, who had teachers who knew their names, who had classmates who had played with them at recess, who had been present in the everyday life of a school community in all the ordinary and irreplaceable ways that children are present. Their absence from those classrooms, the empty desks, the missing voices, was not a statistic. It was a felt reality that the Wellesley school community had to navigate in real time, with children who were old enough to notice and to ask questions and to need support in processing what they were being told. The case raises questions that communities across the socioeconomic spectrum grapple with. Questions about what warning signs look like, about who sees them, and about what systems are in place to respond before a crisis reaches the point of no return. Wealth does not immunize families from the internal pressures, mental health struggles, relationship fractures, the invisible weight of despair that can lead to catastrophic outcomes. And the assumption that affluent neighborhoods are insulated from the kinds of tragedies that make the news in other zip codes is one that Wellesley, like so many communities before it, was forced to confront in the spring of 2026. The MacAusland case is, as of this documentary's production, an active legal matter. Justice for Kai and Ella MacAusland is now in the hands of the Norfolk County court system. This documentary will continue to follow the case as it develops. What can be said with certainty in the present moment is this: two children who were in the first and second grades of their elementary school lives, who had the whole extraordinary, unpredictable, expansive future of childhood ahead of them, are gone. And the community that knew them, the school, the neighborhood, the town, is carrying that loss as it navigates the days ahead. If this case affected you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support means everything to this channel. Case 5, Shana Pedroso, April 9, 2018, Worcester County, Fitchburg, Massachusetts. There are communities in Massachusetts that do not always receive the same sustained media attention as Boston proper. Smaller cities and towns where tragedies unfold with just as much devastation and just as many unresolved questions, but where the cameras tend not to linger as long. Fitchburg is one of those communities. It is a small city in Worcester County, situated roughly 50 miles northwest of Boston, with a working-class history rooted in manufacturing and a population that has navigated more than its share of economic challenges over the past several decades. Fitchburg is a city that has, over the course of its history, been home to paper mills, textile factories, and a range of industrial enterprises that defined life in central Massachusetts for generations. Like many post-industrial New England cities, it has faced the challenges of economic transition, the loss of manufacturing jobs, the pressures of urban poverty, the demands placed on public services in communities where resources are stretched thin. It is a city that its residents have fought for, generation after generation, building community in the spaces between hardship. On the 9th of April, 2018, Fitchburg was at the center of a case that shocked every person who heard the details, and that resulted, for years later, in a legal outcome that finally brought a measure of accountability to the survivors and the memory of those lost. Shana Pedroso was the mother of at least 2 children at the time of the events of April 9th. Her daughter Sophia was 6 years old. Her son, who was 9 years old at the time, was also present in the home on the day in question. What happened to those 2 children on that April day in 2018 represented one of the most severe instances of child abuse resulting in death to be prosecuted in Worcester County in recent memory. According to the evidence presented by prosecutors, Sophia Pedroso sustained catastrophic injuries as a result of physical harm inflicted upon her. She did not survive. Investigators responding to the scene also found Sophia's 9-year-old brother in a condition that required immediate emergency medical attention. He had sustained serious injuries and was transported to a hospital for treatment. The investigation into the events of April 9th produced evidence that prosecutors argued painted a picture of sustained harm within the household. The injuries discovered during the medical examination of both children were inconsistent with any accidental cause. Law enforcement's conclusion, supported by the medical examiner's findings, was that both children had been subjected to severe physical harm, and that the harm inflicted on 6-year-old Sophia had been fatal. First responders who arrived at the scene on April 9th were confronted with a situation that required immediate and coordinated response. Emergency medical personnel working to stabilize the 9-year-old, law enforcement personnel working to secure the scene and begin the process of evidence collection, child welfare workers being contacted to address the broader circumstances of the household. The coordination between those different agencies and disciplines, in the immediate aftermath of the discovery, is a reflection of the kind of multi-system response that serious child welfare emergencies require and that Massachusetts, to its credit, has invested significantly in building. Sophia was taken to a medical facility where attempts were made to address her injuries. Those attempts were not successful. She was pronounced dead. The medical examiner's findings confirmed what the physical evidence at the scene had already indicated, that Sophia's injuries were the result of deliberate harm. Shana Pedroso was charged with murder in connection with Sophia's death, as well as additional charges related to the injuries sustained by her son. The legal process that followed took 4 years to reach its resolution. For years during which the surviving child, Sophia's older brother, had to carry the weight of what he had witnessed and endured. For years during which the case was investigated, the evidence was assembled, and the legal arguments were developed and tested. For the child welfare workers and victim advocates who had been involved in the case from its beginning, those 4 years represented a sustained commitment to seeing the process through, to ensuring that Sophia's case was not lost in a system that handles too many cases with too few resources, and that the outcome reflected the gravity of what had happened on April 9, 2018. The Fitchburg Police Department and the Worcester County District Attorney's Office worked together across that 4-year span to build a case that could survive the scrutiny of the courtroom. The evidence gathered in the immediate aftermath of the discovery, the findings of the medical examiner, the testimony of the medical personnel who had treated the children, the forensic analysis of the scene, all of it was assembled into a case that ultimately led to the plea agreement that resolved the proceedings. In July of 2022, Shana Pedroso pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in connection with the death of Sofia Pedroso. She was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after the statutory minimum required under Massachusetts law for a second-degree murder conviction. The plea and sentencing were covered by local media in Worcester County and received notice in statewide coverage of criminal justice matters. For those who had followed the case from its beginning, the investigators who had responded to the scene in April of 2018, the prosecutors who had spent 4 years building the case, the child welfare advocates who had taken an interest in the circumstances surrounding the family. The resolution represented the delivery of a form of legal accountability that the evidence had always demanded. Sofia Pedroso was 6 years old when she died. She had been in kindergarten or first grade. She was at an age when children are still learning the shape of the world around them, still discovering what they love, who they are, what they want to become. She liked things. She had preferences. She had a way of moving through the world that was entirely her own. That discovery, the ongoing, daily discovery of self that constitutes childhood, was taken from her on a spring day in a small Massachusetts city by the person who had the greatest obligation in the world to keep her safe. Her brother survived. He carries that survival with him. The hope, the profound and serious hope, of everyone who has engaged with this case is that he received, and continues to receive, the support, the care, and the stability that every child who has experienced trauma deserves. Worcester County's child welfare and victim advocacy systems have resources available for children who have experienced abuse and loss, and the commitment of those systems to the survivors of cases like this one is a critical part of the ongoing response to the harm that was done on April 9th. The Fitchburg case, Sophia's case, is a reminder that the geography of child abuse does not respect city limits or income brackets or the relative profile of a community in the media landscape. It happens in small cities as surely as it happens in large ones. And the systems of protection, accountability, and support that are supposed to respond to it must be equally present and equally robust in every corner of the Commonwealth. The Worcester County District Attorney's Office prosecuted this case with diligence and purpose. The legal outcome does not restore what Sophia lost, but it ensures that the person responsible for her death will be held accountable for the duration of her natural life, and that the legal record of what happened in Fitchburg on the 9th of April, 2018, cannot be erased or ignored. Sophia deserved the life that was taken from her. She deserved to grow up in Fitchburg, in a household where the person who was supposed to protect her actually did. The legal system, however imperfectly, has placed on the record that what happened to her was wrong, that it was criminal, and that it carries consequences. That is the minimum that Sophia's life demanded. It was delivered. And the community of Fitchburg, the neighbors, the schools, the churches, the advocates who have worked in the shadow of this case for years, can hold that delivery as a form of justice, even as they know it is not, and can never be, enough. Please like this video, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour if this story is important to you. Together we keep the memory of victims like Sophia alive. Case 6, Jennifer Prudencio, April 6, 2024, Suffolk County, Chelsea, Massachusetts. Chelsea is a small, dense city directly north of Boston, separated from the city proper by the Chelsea Creek and connected to it by bridges that carry commuters, freight, and the daily commerce of a working-class urban community that has, over the past 3 decades, been engaged in a remarkable and ongoing process of civic revitalization. It is a city with one of the most diverse populations in Massachusetts, a community where multiple languages are spoken on every block and where the ties of neighborhood and mutual support run deep. Chelsea's revitalization story is one of the more compelling urban governance narratives in recent New England history. In the early 1990s, the the city was placed under state receivership following a period of severe financial mismanagement and institutional dysfunction. The receivership period, during which an appointed administrator rather than an elected government ran the city, was painful and controversial. But it resulted, over the course of the decade that followed, in a restructured city government, improved public finances, and a gradual rebuilding of civic capacity that has continued into the present. Today, Chelsea is a city that its residents are proud of, a city with active neighborhood associations, a vibrant and diverse commercial district, strong community organizations, and a population that has demonstrated, across generations of immigration and economic challenge, a remarkable capacity for mutual support and collective resilience. It is also, like every community, a place where the most vulnerable members, the youngest, the most dependent, the least able to advocate for themselves, rely on the adults around them to make choices that keep them safe. On the 6th of April, 2024, one of those vulnerable members, a 3-year-old boy named Yoel, did not receive the care and protection that his life depended upon, and the consequences were fatal. Jennifer Prudencio was Yoel's mother. On the night of April 6th, Yoel was ill. The precise nature of his illness, and the degree to which it was apparent to those in the household, became a central element of the case that prosecutors would later build against Prudencio. What is established in the public record is this: Yoel was sick. He was 3 years old. He needed adult supervision and care. Instead of remaining with her ill toddler, Prudencio left the apartment. She spent the night at a bar in Revere, a city adjacent to Boston, known for its beachfront and its active nightlife district. While she was away, Yoel was left in the care of his siblings, children who were 7 and 8 years old. 7 and 8 years old. These were elementary school children. Children who were themselves in need of adult care and supervision. Children who were entirely unequipped, through no fault of their own, by virtue simply of their age and their developmental stage, to manage a medical emergency involving a toddler. The responsibility of caring for an ill 3-year-old would challenge a trained adult. For children of 7 and 8, it was a burden that they were simply not equipped to carry. During the course of the night, Prudencio received text messages from those children. The content of those messages, as described in court documents, indicated that Yoel was not responsive, that he was not waking up, that something was very wrong. Prudencio did not return. She did not call emergency services. She remained at the bar in Revere while her 3-year-old son lay unresponsive in their Chelsea apartment, supervised only by his 7 and 8-year-old siblings who did not have the experience, the knowledge, or the resources to understand what was happening or what to do. It is worth pausing on that detail, the texts, because there is something in the image of those messages, sent by children to a parent in the middle of the night, about a sibling who would not wake up, that captures the full human weight of this case more powerfully than any summary of legal charges or sentencing outcomes can. Children, reaching through a phone to find the adult who was supposed to be there, telling that adult, in the best language they had available, that something was wrong, and not being answered with the return trip that would have mattered. By the time Yoel received medical attention, it was too late. He did not survive. Jennifer Prudencio was charged with involuntary manslaughter. The charge reflects the prosecution's position that while Prudencio's actions did not constitute an intentional act of harm, they represented a level of recklessness and criminal negligence, a criminal disregard for the safety and well-being of a child in her care, that the law is obligated to hold accountable. Involuntary manslaughter under Massachusetts law does not require proof that a defendant intended to harm the person who died. It requires proof that the defendant's conduct was reckless, that it demonstrated a disregard for the risk of harm to others that goes beyond ordinary negligence into the territory of criminal culpability. Prosecutors argued that leaving an ill 3-year-old in the care of 7 and 8-year-old children and then failing to respond to text messages indicating that the child was unresponsive met that standard. The case, as it made its way through the Suffolk County courts, raised questions that extend far beyond the actions of one individual on one spring night. It raised questions about the weight of parental responsibility, about what it means to answer a call for help when the person calling is too young to fully articulate what they need, about the texts that were read and set aside, about the hours that passed while a child was in distress and no one with the power to help was making the decision to intervene. It also raised questions about the support systems, or the absence of them, that surrounded the Prudencio family. What resources were available to this household? What stresses was Prudencio carrying? What systems, if any, had been in contact with the family before April 6th? These questions do not excuse what happened, but they are the questions that a serious society asks in the aftermath of a tragedy like this one, because the answers to those questions are the ones that can inform better policy, better resource allocation, and better support for families in distress before the distress reaches a crisis point. Yoel was 3 years old. He was at an age when children are just beginning to develop the vocabulary to describe what they are feeling, to ask for what they need, to put words to the world they are encountering for the first time. He did not have the words for what was happening to him that night. He did not need to. The people who were supposed to hear him, the adult in his life with the greatest power and the greatest responsibility to protect him, should not have needed words. The text that came through on her phone should have been enough. For Yoel, they were not. The Chelsea community responded to the case with grief and with the kind of anger that arises when an act of parental neglect results in the death of a child who was completely dependent on the adults around him. Child welfare advocates pointed to the case as an example of the devastating consequences that can follow from the absence of meaningful adult supervision. Legal advocates noted that the involuntary manslaughter charge carries consequences that, while significant, reflect the degree of criminal intent, or its absence, that the prosecution was able to establish under Massachusetts law. Whatever sentence the court ultimately imposes in this case, the outcome of the legal proceedings cannot undo what happened to Yoel. It cannot give him back the years he should have had. It cannot answer the question of what he might have become, what he might have loved, what he might have built, what he might have said to the world if the world had simply kept him safe. What it can do, what the legal process in a case like this is designed to do, is establish clearly, for the record and for the community, that the choices made on the 6th of April, 2024, were not acceptable. That a child's life has value. That the responsibility of caring for a young child is not optional, is not discretionary, and is not something that can be set aside in favor of an evening out without consequence. Yoel deserved better. Chelsea is a community that knows it. And the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, in bringing charges in this case, has ensured that the record reflects it. The 2 children who were left in charge that night, Yoel's 7- and 8-year-old siblings, are themselves survivors of this case. They did what children do when they are in over their heads and scared. They reached for the adult who was supposed to be there. The fact that that adult did not come back is not something those children caused. It is something they were subjected to. And their well-being, their path forward, their healing, the stability of whatever household they now call home, is a matter of urgent and ongoing importance to the child welfare professionals and advocates who have been engaged with this case. If you are a parent, if you are in a situation where you are struggling, where the demands of caring for your children feel overwhelming, where the choices in front of you feel impossible, please reach out. There are resources available. There are people who can help. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453 is one of them. Reaching for help is not failure. It is the most important thing you can do for the children who depend on you. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Every case we cover is a story of a life that mattered. Case 7, Latarsha Sanders, February 5, 2018, Plymouth County, Brockton, Massachusetts. Brockton is a city with history. It is the birthplace of 2 heavyweight boxing champions, Rocky Marciano and Marvelous Marvin Hagler, and carries in its civic identity the pride and the struggle of a post-industrial New England city that has known both greatness and hardship. It sits approximately 25 miles south of Boston, in Plymouth County, and it is a city of working families, of diverse communities, of churches and schools and block associations that work every day to build and sustain the fabric of neighborhood life. Brockton is also a city that has had to reckon, across its history, with the full range of challenges that urban communities face, challenges of economic inequality, of public health, of the kinds of concentrated stress that poverty and instability can create in the lives of families and children. It is a city that its residents have refused to give up on, generation after generation, because they know that the measure of a community is not whether it faces difficulty, but how it responds to it. On the 5th of February, 2018, That fabric was torn in a way that left Brockton reeling, and that set in motion a legal and psychiatric process that would take 5 years to reach its conclusion. Latarsha Sanders was a resident of Brockton. She was the mother of 2 sons, one who was 5 years old and one who was 8 years old. On the morning of February 5th, she subjected both of her children to an act of violence so severe, so incomprehensible, that the first responders who arrived at the scene required critical incident support in the aftermath of what they witnessed. The call to emergency services on the morning of February 5th, 2018, brought police and emergency medical personnel to the Sanders household in Brockton. What they found when they arrived required an immediate and coordinated response. Both children were in critical need of medical attention, and the scene itself presented a level of trauma that tested the professional composure of the experienced first responders who entered it. Both boys were transported to the hospital in critical condition. By some extraordinary combination of medical intervention and what can only be described as the sheer will to survive, both children survived. Though the road to physical recovery was long, and the psychological and emotional recovery will be a process that continues across the full arc of their lives. The survival of both children is the fact in this case that this documentary holds most carefully and most deliberately. 2 boys who were placed in harm's way by the person who was supposed to protect them survived. They are alive. That fact, the fact of their survival, is the ground on which every other element of this case rests. And it is the fact that gives the story of February 5th, 2018 a dimension that is different from cases in which no children walked away. Sanders was taken into custody. In the statements she provided to investigators, statements that became central to the legal and psychiatric battle that would define her case for the next 5 years, she described her actions as part of a ritual. She articulated a belief system, an internal framework of meaning, that she said had governed what she had done to her sons. Investigators and forensic psychiatrists who reviewed those statements were tasked with one of the most complex questions the criminal justice system can pose. The question of whether those beliefs reflected a genuine and disabling break with reality that should be recognized as a legal defense, or whether they reflected something else, something that the law, however imperfectly, is still required to hold accountable. Forensic psychiatry, the discipline that sits at the intersection of mental health science and the legal system, is asked to do difficult things. It is asked to translate the language of diagnosis and symptom into the language of legal standards and criminal responsibility. It is asked to establish, to a degree of professional certainty, whether a specific person, at a specific moment in time, was in a specific state of mind. Those are not easy questions, and the answers that forensic psychiatrists provide are not always consistent. Different experts, examining the same evidence, can reach different conclusions about the nature and the legal significance of a person's mental state. In the Sanders case, the battle between competing expert testimonies, the defense's experts arguing for a finding of not criminally responsible, the prosecution's experts arguing against it, extended across years of pretrial proceedings and ultimately had to be resolved by a jury applying the legal standard to the totality of the evidence presented. The Sanders case moved through the Plymouth County court system across a span of 5 years, delayed in part by the pandemic and in part by the extensive psychiatric evaluations that her defense team required to build their case. Defense attorneys argued consistently and forcefully that Sanders had been in the grip of a severe mental health crisis on the morning of February 5th, that her state of mind had been so profoundly compromised by psychiatric illness that she should be found not criminally responsible for her actions under Massachusetts law. Prosecutors presented their own expert testimony. They argued that while the evidence of Sanders' disturbed mental state was not in dispute, the legal standard for criminal responsibility in Massachusetts required more than the presence of mental illness. It required that the defendant have been unable, as a result of that illness, to appreciate the wrongfulness of her actions. The jury was asked to weigh that standard against the totality of the evidence presented over the course of the trial. In 2023, 5 years after the events of February 5, 2018, Latarsha Sanders was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict was among the most consequential outcomes in Plymouth County's recent criminal history. It represented the jury's determination that, whatever the nature and severity of Sanders' mental health condition, The legal standard for a finding of not criminally responsible had not been met. It represented, in the most direct legal sense, a finding of full criminal accountability. The reaction to the verdict was not uniform. Mental health advocates pointed to the case as an example of the profound inadequacy of the American legal system's approach to serious psychiatric illness, of a system that was designed, in their view, to punish rather than to treat. Others argued that the jury had gotten it right, that the devastating harm inflicted on 2 children demanded accountability, and that the verdict appropriately reflected the gravity of what Sanders had done. Both of Sanders' sons survived. They are alive. They are older now, older by the full span of years that has elapsed since the morning of February 5, 2018. Whatever support, whatever therapeutic resources, whatever stability and care have been available to them in the years since that morning, the hope of every reasonable person who has engaged with this case is that they have received what they needed and that they have found, within themselves and within the people around them, the strength to build lives that are defined by more than the worst day they have ever known. The Brockton community has not forgotten this case. The Plymouth County District Attorney's Office prosecuted it with thoroughness and determination across a 5-year span. The legal outcome is on the record. The children who were harmed on February 5, 2018, who survived when survival itself seemed impossible, deserve every good thing that the future can offer them. And the community of Brockton, which has seen its share of heartbreak and has never stopped building itself back up from it, carries this case as one more part of the complicated, painful, ultimately resilient story of a city that refuses to be defined solely by its hardest moments. If this story affected you, please like and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Your support is what keeps this channel going. Case 8. Erika Murray. August 2014, Worcester County, Blackstone, Massachusetts. The town of Blackstone sits in the southern corner of Worcester County, near the Rhode Island border, a small and quiet community of roughly 9,000 residents built along the banks of the Blackstone River. It is the kind of place where the pace of life is measured, where residents tend to know their neighbors, and where the idea that something fundamentally wrong could be happening inside a house on an ordinary street, for months or years, without anyone being certain of it strains the imagination. The Blackstone River Valley is one of the most historically significant industrial corridors in American history. It was here, in the late 18th century, that the American Industrial Revolution took its first steps, in the mills that harnessed the river's energy to power the textile manufacturing that transformed the economy of New England and eventually the nation. Blackstone sits at the southern end of that valley, and its identity is shaped, as so many New England mill towns' identities are shaped, by the twin legacies of industrial history and post-industrial transition. Today, Blackstone is a quiet, primarily residential community. Its streets are lined with houses that reflect the modest prosperity of a working-class town, not wealthy, but stable, not glamorous, but grounded. It is a town where, in the ordinary course of life, the expectation is that houses on ordinary streets contain ordinary families doing ordinary things. And yet, in August of 2014, the Blackstone Police Department responded to a call at a residential address on Hill Street. What they found inside that house prompted a response involving multiple law enforcement agencies, Child Protective Services, the state medical examiner, and a hazmat team. What they found inside that house would become known, in media coverage that reached across New England and beyond, as the House of Horrors. The term is stark. It is a term that the media reaches for when a residential space has been so thoroughly transformed by neglect, by accumulation, by the collapse of the ordinary structures of domestic life, that it no longer resembles the kind of space that people are supposed to inhabit. The Hill Street house in Blackstone, in August of 2014, fit that description. Erika Murray had been living in that house with her children for years. The conditions inside were, by every account in the investigative and legal record, extreme. The house was filled with an accumulation of refuse and decay that made navigation difficult, and that created an environment profoundly dangerous to human health. Animals, and the remains of animals, were found throughout the structure. The odor, according to first responders, was detectable before investigators had even entered the building. The conditions in that house were not the product of a single bad month or a temporary crisis. They were the product of years. Years during which the accumulation had grown, during which the household had existed in a state of progressive deterioration, during which children had been living inside a space that no child should ever have had to inhabit. And among the accumulated debris of years of neglect, investigators made the discovery that transformed the case from a child welfare and public health matter into a criminal investigation of an entirely different gravity. The remains of 3 infants were found inside the house. 3 infants. Their remains had been present in that house for an indeterminate period of time. The state of the evidence, shaped by the conditions of the environment in which the remains were found, made the medical examiner's task enormously difficult. Establishing the cause and manner of death for each set of remains required meticulous forensic work under challenging circumstances. The Worcester County Medical Examiner's Office brought every available resource to bear on the analysis. The findings it produced informed the criminal charges that prosecutors ultimately brought. Erika Murray was the mother of children who had been living in those conditions. She was also identified as the individual whose biological connection to the infant remains was established in the course of the investigation. The community of Blackstone learned, in the days and weeks following the August discovery, that a house they had passed without necessarily thinking twice about, a house on a street they knew, in a town they felt they understood, had contained realities they had not imagined. Neighbors, in interviews conducted in the aftermath of the discovery, described a property that had long presented visible signs of neglect. They described what they had noticed and what they had not known, and their accounts raised the questions that always arise in cases like this one. What had been seen, what had been reported, and what had been done with those reports? The legal process that followed the August 2014 discovery was long and, ultimately, produced a verdict that many observers found surprising. After years of proceedings, Murray was acquitted of the murder charges that had been brought in connection with the infant remains. The acquittal reflected the jury's determination that the evidence presented by prosecutors had not established, to the standard required for a criminal conviction, the specific facts necessary to support a murder finding. The forensic evidence, compromised by the conditions in which the remains had been stored and the environment in which the house had been maintained, could not provide the kind of definitive answers that murder charges require. But Murray was not simply released. She was convicted of child endangerment, charges related to the conditions in which the children who were alive in the house had been living, and of animal cruelty. She received a sentence that the Worcester County Court imposed in 2019, following the conclusion of the lengthy legal proceedings. The case generated an enormous amount of media attention and public discussion. Child welfare advocates raised urgent questions about how the conditions in that house had been allowed to persist for as long as they had, about what mechanisms of oversight and intervention had been available and had not been triggered. Neighbors, in interviews conducted in the aftermath of the discovery, described a property that had long presented visible signs of neglect, signs that had not resulted in the kind of intervention that might have changed the outcome for the children inside. The 3 infants whose remains were discovered in that Blackstone house were never publicly named. Whatever the legal resolution of the charges connected to their deaths, they existed. They were present, in that house, among the evidence of years of neglect. The legal system did what it could with the evidence it had. The community and the child welfare advocates who followed the case continue to ask the questions that the legal system's acquittal of the most serious charges did not answer. Questions about what should have been seen sooner, what should have been reported sooner, and what systems of oversight failed to catch what was happening on Hill Street in Blackstone before August of 2014. The children who were found alive in that house, Murray's living children, who were removed and placed in the care of the state, represent the survivors of this case. Their path forward, their healing, their safety and stability in the years since 2014 is the part of this story that exists beyond the cameras and the court records. It is the part that matters most. Because behind the dramatic details of the discovery, the hazmat team, the media coverage, the national attention, there are children who are alive and who deserve to build futures that are entirely separate from what happened on Hill Street, who deserve privacy, stability, support, and every ordinary good thing that childhood is supposed to contain. The system that removed them from that house, the child welfare apparatus of Worcester County and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, became responsible, from August 2014 forward, for ensuring that they receive those things. The Blackstone case is a permanent part of the public record of Worcester County and of Massachusetts. It is a case that revealed the extent to which neglect can operate invisibly within a community, accumulating across years into something catastrophic, while the ordinary mechanisms of neighborhood awareness and institutional oversight fail to intervene. It is a case that asks hard questions, questions without fully satisfying answers, about the visibility of hidden harm and the systems that are supposed to see it. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. These stories deserve to be told and remembered. Case 9, Erin Pascal, December 25, 2019, Suffolk County, Roxbury, Boston, Massachusetts. There is no date on the calendar that carries a heavier symbolic weight than Christmas Day. For most families, the 25th of December is defined by warmth, by the presence of children, by the particular magic that the holiday generates in young minds not yet old enough to have had it worn away. Children on Christmas morning are a kind of pure joy, expectant, luminous, entirely present in the moment. Roxbury is one of Boston's oldest and most historically layered neighborhoods. It sits in the heart of the city, bordered by Jamaica Plain to the southwest and Dorchester to the southeast, and it carries within its geography and its architecture the full sweep of Boston's social and racial history. Roxbury has been home to waves of immigrants and migrants across centuries. Irish, Jewish, and then, in the great northward migration of the 20th century, a large and vibrant African-American community that transformed the neighborhood's character and built institutions, churches, civic organizations, schools, businesses, that gave Roxbury a cultural identity that persists to this day. It is a neighborhood that has faced more than its share of systemic challenge, economic disinvestment, urban renewal policies that razed established communities, the drug crisis of the 1980s and 90s that left deep marks on families and blocks across the neighborhood. And it is a neighborhood that has responded to those challenges, generation after generation, with a resilience and a community spirit that its residents hold with justified pride. In the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston, on the morning of December 25, 2019, two children woke up. A 4-year-old girl, a 16-month-old boy. Their names have not been released publicly out of respect for the privacy of minors and the wishes of surviving family members, and this documentary will honor that. What happened to those two children on Christmas morning 2019 is the darkest story in this documentary. It is presented here not for shock value, not to generate fear or to satisfy a morbid curiosity, but because it happened, because it is part of the public record, and because the victims and the community that carries the weight of this case deserve to have their story told with honesty, with care, and with the full acknowledgement of its human cost. Erin Pascal was the mother of those two children. On Christmas morning, she placed her daughter and her son in a vehicle. She drove to the Renaissance Park Garage, a multi-story parking structure in the Roxbury neighborhood. She made her way to the rooftop level of that structure. And there, on the roof of that garage, on Christmas morning, with the city spread out around her and the winter light coming in from the east, she subjected both of her children to an act so devastating that the investigators, the emergency responders, and the community members who became aware of the details have carried the weight of it ever since. Neither child survived. Erin Pascal also sustained severe injuries. The case was investigated by the Boston Police Department and was ultimately ruled a double murder-suicide. Pascal did not survive to face criminal charges. The moment that the news reached the Roxbury community, and then the broader Boston community, and then the national media landscape that the story quickly entered, was a moment of collective shock that the date only deepened. Christmas Day, a garage rooftop, two children. It was a combination of details so contrary to the ordinary associations of the season that it seemed, to many people who encountered the story, almost incomprehensible, almost impossible to absorb. But it was real. And the community of Roxbury, which has absorbed more than its share of real and terrible things across its history, absorbed this one too, with grief, with anger, with the quiet dignity of a neighborhood that has never been defined by the worst of what has happened within it. The Roxbury community, a neighborhood with deep roots and a powerful collective identity, a neighborhood that has navigated more than its share of tragedy across the decades, received the news of Christmas morning, 2019 with a grief that seemed to have no adequate outlet. A grief that was intensified by the date, by the ages of the children, by the particular cruelty of the context in which their lives had ended. What were the circumstances that led to that Christmas morning? What was happening in Erin Pascal's life in the weeks and months before December 25th? What signs, if any, were visible to the people around her? What systems of support were or were not available to her? These are questions that, in cases ruled as murder-suicide, the investigative and public health community attempts to address, not to assign blame to individuals who had no control over the events, but to understand what interventions might have been possible and what systems might be strengthened to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The research on maternal filicide, the term used in clinical and academic literature for cases in which a mother takes the life of her own child, identifies a range of contributing factors that appear across many such cases: severe depression, postpartum mood disorders, psychosis, domestic violence, extreme stress, economic precarity, social isolation, and the crushing weight of a mental health crisis that has gone unrecognized or untreated. In none of these cases does the identification of contributing factors constitute an excuse or a justification. But it does constitute an explanation, a basis for understanding, for policy, for intervention, for the systemic changes that could mean the difference between a Christmas morning and a tragedy. The Boston Public Health Commission and the network of mental health providers that serves the Roxbury community have, in the years since December 25, 2019, continued to work on the systems and the access points that are supposed to reach people in crisis before crisis becomes catastrophe. That work is ongoing. It is underfunded relative to the scale of the need. And it is, nonetheless, happening, because the professionals who do it know, with the certainty that only sustained engagement with a community's pain can generate, that prevention is possible and that every intervention that succeeds represents a future that was preserved. The two children lost on Christmas morning, 2019 in Roxbury were real. They were present in the world. They were loved by members of their family and community who are still carrying the weight of their absence. This documentary carries their memory with it. If you or someone you know is in crisis, please reach out to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 988 or text HOME to 74741 to reach the crisis text line. Help exists. It is available. And reaching for it is not weakness. It is the most important thing a person in crisis can do, for themselves and for the people who depend on them. If this case was important to you, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Together we honor those who deserve to be remembered. Case 10, Vanessa Jeising, January 2, 2023, Essex County, Peabody, Massachusetts. Peabody is a mid-sized city in Essex County, approximately 15 miles north of Boston along the Route 1 corridor. A city with a strong sense of local identity, a history rooted in the leather tanning industry, and a community that takes its responsibilities toward its youngest and most vulnerable residents seriously. The leather industry that defined Peabody's economic identity across the 19th and early 20th centuries made the city one of the most important manufacturing centers in New England. At its peak, Peabody produced a substantial percentage of the nation's leather goods, and the city's identity was built around the craftsmanship, the labor, and the community spirit of the workers who built that industry with their hands. Like many manufacturing cities, Peabody has had to navigate the transition away from that industrial base as the 20th century progressed, a transition that brought economic challenge alongside the development of new commercial and residential character. Today, Peabody is a city that balances its industrial history with a suburban character, a place of established neighborhoods, active civic organizations, and a population that takes pride in the city's particular identity as a place that is neither fully urban nor fully suburban, but something distinctly its own. On the 2nd of January, 2023, just 2 days into the new year, in a period when most families were still in the warmth and aftermath of the holiday season, a 2-year-old girl named Lily Jeising was found unresponsive. Emergency services were called. Lily was transported to a hospital for treatment. She did not survive. The investigation that followed the discovery of Lily's condition led law enforcement to Lily's mother, Vanessa Jeising. The circumstances of the case, as they emerged through the investigation and the subsequent legal proceedings, raised serious questions about the conditions in which Lily had been living and about the choices that had been made in the critical period before her death. Lily was 2 years old. She was at that particular stage of early childhood, sometimes called the toddler years, when children are moving through the world with a new physical confidence, asserting their own preferences and personalities, discovering language and play, and the full sensory richness of the world around them. She was at the age when children laugh at things that don't quite make sense to adults, when they develop favorite foods and favorite toys and favorite ways of being held, when the relationship between parent and child is being built, moment by moment, out of the accumulation of small daily interactions. Lily deserved those years. She deserved the years that follow them. She deserved to grow up. Among the evidence gathered by investigators was the discovery of narcotics in the vehicle that had been used to transport Lily to the hospital. The presence of those substances and the implications of their presence for the conditions of care in the household became a central element of the case that prosecutors built against Jeising. Vanessa Jeising was indicted by an Essex County grand jury on charges of reckless endangerment and drug-related offenses in connection with Lily's death. The charges reflect the prosecution's position that while the evidence did not support a finding of intentional harm, the level of negligence and recklessness demonstrated by Jeising's conduct, and the causal relationship between that conduct and the conditions that led to Lily's death, was sufficient to warrant criminal accountability under Massachusetts law. The Jeising case sits in a category of child death cases that prosecutors and child welfare advocates find among the most challenging and the most heartbreaking to navigate. Cases where the harm to a child was not the product of deliberate violent intent, but of a catastrophic failure of judgment and parental responsibility that was itself the product of a dependency on substances that had consumed the adult's capacity to prioritize the safety of the child in their care. Substance use disorder, drug addiction, is recognized by the medical and public health communities as a chronic disease. It is a condition that rewires the brain's reward and decision-making architecture in ways that can make even the most fundamental parental instincts, the instinct to protect, to prioritize, to be present, extraordinarily difficult to act upon consistently. This is not an excuse. It is a neurological reality. And it is a reality that the public health community argues must be addressed not only through the criminal justice system, which responds after harm has occurred, but through the treatment and support systems that are supposed to reach people before the harm becomes irreversible. It is also a reality that places children, the children of parents in active addiction, in an extraordinarily vulnerable position. They cannot advocate for themselves. They cannot seek help independently. They cannot make phone calls or send texts or leave the house. They are entirely dependent on the adult who is supposed to care for them. And when that adult's capacity for care has been compromised by the demands of an active addiction, the child bears the consequences of a crisis that is not theirs and that they have no power to address. Children born to or raised by parents in the grip of active addiction face elevated risks across every dimension of safety and well-being. The research on this is clear and has been clear for decades. The question of what a civilized society owes those children, and what accountability looks like when a child dies in the orbit of a parent's addiction, is one that courts, legislators, and child welfare systems across the country continue to grapple with. In Essex County, the child welfare and legal systems responded to Lily Jeising's death by pursuing criminal accountability through the indictment of Vanessa Jeising. That accountability, whatever form it ultimately takes in the sentencing phase of the proceedings, represents the legal system's recognition that Lily's life had value, that the conditions that led to her death were not acceptable, and that the law must reflect both of those realities. For families affected by substance use disorder, either their own or a loved one's, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration's National Helpline is available at 1-800-662-4357, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It is free, confidential, and available in English and Spanish. Help is real. It is accessible. And for every parent who reaches for it before the worst has happened, there is a child somewhere whose future remains intact. Peabody's child welfare community, the DCF workers, the school counselors, the pediatric healthcare providers, the community organizations that serve families in need, continues to work every day to identify children in vulnerable situations and to connect their families with the support that could change the trajectory of their lives. That work is essential. It is underdramatic. And it is the work that, in the cases where it succeeds, means that a 2-year-old girl gets to turn 3 and 4 and 5 and all the ages after that. Lily Jeising did not get those ages. She got 2 years. And in those 2 years, in the particular, irreplaceable, unrepeatable experience of being Lily, of seeing the world for the first time through her specific eyes, she was real in a way that this documentary is committed to honoring. The legal proceedings in the Jeising case are a matter of public record in Essex County. The accountability they represent, whatever its ultimate form, is owed to Lily. And Lily, like every child whose story has been told in this documentary, deserved more than the world gave her. She deserved everything. Before we close, Cold Case Hour wants to acknowledge every child whose story was told in this documentary. Bella, the 4 infants of South Boston, Cora, Dawson, and Callan, Kai and Ella, Sophia, Yael, the 2 children from Roxbury, Lily. These cases span different neighborhoods, different communities, different circumstances, and different legal outcomes. What they share is this. Each of them involved a child who was dependent on the adults around them for safety, care, and protection. Each of them involved a failure of that protection. And each of them has left a mark on the communities and the systems that are still working every day to do better. If you are concerned about the safety of a child, please call the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. Available 24 hours a day. Your call could save a life. If you are struggling with a mental health crisis, please call or text 988. If you are affected by substance use disorder, please call SAMHSA's National Helpline at 1-800-662-4357. Thank you for watching Cold Case Hour. If this documentary moved you, informed you, or reminded you of why these stories matter, please hit the like button, leave a comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour so you never miss another episode. Your support is what makes it possible for us to keep telling the stories that deserve to be told. We will see you in the next one.